12 most isolated ancient sites in Australia, and why nobody visits them. There is a stretch of red sandstone plateau in the far northwest of Western Australia where a canyon drops without warning into absolute shadow. The walls on either side are covered from ground level to a height of 30 feet with human figures, animals, and shapes that do not correspond to anything a researcher has been able to classify. The figures were not painted yesterday. Conservative dating places the oldest layers at somewhere between 40 and 50,000 years before the present moment. Some estimates go higher. The canyon sits more than 400 kilometers from the nearest sealed road. There are no signs pointing toward it. There is no car park. There is no fence. The people who know it exists are not in the habit of publishing coordinates. And yet the images keep watching from the rock, patient in the way that only very old things can be, waiting for a question that nobody has yet thought to ask. Australia is the oldest inhabited continent on Earth. That sentence gets repeated often enough that it has started to lose its weight. But sit with the actual number for a moment. 65,000 years of continuous human presence, unbroken, in a single landmass. That is longer than the oldest known permanent settlements in the Middle East. It is longer than the emergence of Homo sapiens as a distinct species in the fossil record of East Africa. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who have called this place home across that entire span, did not live passively inside a static landscape. They built, they marked, they modified, they remembered, and they passed down the knowledge of what they had done across a chain of generations so long that a single human life represents only the thinnest sliver of it. But here is what does not make it into the brochures. Most of these places are not accessible, not inconveniently accessible, not requiring a long hike accessible, genuinely, structurally, and in many cases, deliberately inaccessible. Some sit inside traditional country, where entry requires permission from custodian communities that have no obligation to grant it. Some require a working four-wheel drive, a week of supplies, satellite communication equipment, and the kind of navigation skill that comes from years of experience in remote Australian terrain. Some are simply unknown to the broader public because the people responsible for them have chosen not to publicise their location, and that choice deserves more respect than the tourist industry typically gives it. And some are unknown because the Australian interior is genuinely that vast. A site can be significant, documented by a single researcher in an expedition report that nobody else has read, and still be effectively invisible to the rest of the world. This video covers 12 of those places. Not all of them can be named precisely, because naming them precisely would undermine the reason some communities have kept them quiet. But each one represents something real about the depth of human history in this country, and each one carries a reason why reaching it remains something very few people will ever do. The Dampier Archipelago sits off the Pilbara coast of Western Australia, and it holds what may be the largest concentration of rock engravings anywhere on the planet. The number typically quoted is over 1 million individual petroglyphs spread across a group of islands that includes Murujuga, also known as Burrup Peninsula, and the surrounding smaller land masses. The figures include animals that no longer exist in Australia, including the thylacine, which disappeared from the mainland at least 2,000 years ago, and from Tasmania in the 20th century. They include human figures engaged in activities that researchers have spent decades debating. They include what appear to be astronomical representations, and they cover rock surfaces that stretch for kilometres in every direction. The reason most people have never stood among them is partly industrial and partly bureaucratic. The Burrup Peninsula is the site of one of the largest natural gas processing facilities in the world. The area around the NWS Venture and Pluto LNG facilities has been actively developed since the 1980s, and a significant portion of the rock art sits either adjacent to or within operational industrial zones. Access to much of the peninsula requires permits. Some areas are restricted to workers. The conflict between industrial development and the preservation of what sits on those rocks has been documented and debated for 4 decades without resolution. The Murujuga National Park was gazetted in 2013 and covers part of the archipelago, but access to the most significant concentrations of imagery still requires planning, timing, and in some cases, the right contacts. For a site that may represent the oldest continuous artistic tradition on Earth, the practical visitor experience is remarkably complicated. Moving east along the Pilbara and into the Gibson Desert, the density of marked landscape does not decrease. It changes character. The engravings of the coast give way to painted surfaces in rock shelter after rock shelter, accumulating in layers that researchers have described as stratigraphic archives, meaning each layer was applied at a different period in time, and each layer sits atop the one that preceded it. The oldest layers in some of these shelters have been dated to periods that push against the limits of the dating technology currently available. The heat, the distance, and the complete absence of infrastructure make most of these shelters inaccessible in any practical sense. A researcher reaching one typically requires a helicopter charter out of Newman or Meekatharra, permission from the relevant land council, a guide with specific knowledge of the country, and days of planning. A tourist making the same trip independently is not a realistic scenario. The Quinkan rock art sites of Cape York in Queensland occupy a different kind of remoteness. They are not separated from civilization by hundreds of kilometres of desert. They sit in a region that has a functioning road, a small township called Jawalbina in reasonable proximity, and a guided tour operation that has been running for years. And yet, the full extent of the Quinkan galleries, the deep shelters, and overhangs that go beyond the touristed areas remains unknown to most visitors who make the trip. The figures painted on the walls of the deeper shelters include entities that do not correspond to any animal in the modern Australian fauna. Long, angular forms with exaggerated limbs and no obvious biological classification. The Quinkan figures, as they are called, appear in multiple galleries across the region, suggesting they were not a local invention, but a widely shared visual language. What they represent is knowledge held within the community, traditions of the Angnara people, and that knowledge has not been fully published in any academic paper. The reason the outlying galleries remain unvisited is partly the terrain and partly the decision of the traditional owners to keep certain areas closed. The rock country of Cape York is steep, fractured, and disorienting, even for people with experience navigating it. Without a guide who knows the specific paths between shelters, the galleries beyond the main tourist circuit are effectively hidden by the landscape itself. That is not an accident. The Karlu Karlu, known in English as Devil's Marbles, sits along the Stewart Highway south of Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory. It is one of the more accessible sites on this list in terms of road distance, but the cultural depth of the place is consistently underrepresented in how it is presented to visitors. The granite boulders, scattered across several kilometres of open spinifex country, are explained in most tourist materials as the result of geological weathering, which is accurate but incomplete. The Kaiterie, Aliawar, Warramungu, and Walpiri peoples have maintained relationships with this country across timescales that dwarf the geological explanation. The site holds ceremony, story, and obligation that is not on the interpretive signage. What makes it isolated in the sense relevant to this video is not the physical distance, but the distance between what is shown to passing travellers and what the place actually contains. Further south, in the country around Alice Springs and extending into the West MacDonnell Ranges, there are sites that have no public profile at all. A researcher named Theodore Strelo spent decades in the early to mid 20th century documenting secret ceremonial objects and sacred geography across this region, work that resulted in a collection so sensitive that it was sealed after his death and remains partially inaccessible to this day. The sites he documented, the ground, the stones, the water sources, the routes between them, represent a geography of meaning that exists in parallel to the physical geography recorded on any map. These sacred landscapes cannot be visited because the knowledge required to understand them is held within ceremony, and the ceremony belongs to specific people who have inherited the right to conduct it. The Pilbara site, known informally among researchers as the Gallery of Hands, sits in a gorge system that drains south from the Hamersley Range. The name is descriptive. The walls are covered with hand stencils, applied in ochre, through a technique that involves placing the hand flat against the rock surface and blowing pigment around it, leaving a negative outline. This technique appears in sites across Australia and across the world, but the concentration in this particular gorge is unusual. The stencils are layered, suggesting repeated visits over a very long period, and they include hands of different sizes, indicating that people of different ages, including children, participated in the marking. The gorge itself is accessible only on foot from a point that requires a four-wheel drive to reach, and the track to that point is not marked on publicly available navigation systems. The relevant land council has been deliberate about this. Lake Mungo in the far southwest of New South Wales is the best known site on this list, but it earns its place here because even with its relative fame, the full significance of what has been found there remains poorly understood by most Australians. The lake itself has been dry for roughly 20,000 years. The lunette, the wind-formed arc of sediment on the eastern edge of the former lake bed, contains human burials that include Mungo Man, whose remains represent the oldest known human burial with ritual ochre in the world, and Mungo Woman, whose cremated remains are even older, making them the oldest known human cremation on Earth. The site was returned to the custodianship of the three traditional owner groups, the Pakanji, Ngayampa, and Muthi Muthi peoples, following decades of dispute. Access is now managed through those communities. The visitor experience available to the general public covers a fraction of what the landscape contains, and the custodians have not been obligated to expand it. Moving to South Australia, the Flinders Ranges hold a layer of ancient occupation that extends well beyond the Wilpena Pound attraction that draws the majority of visitors to the region. In the country around Arkarula and extending north into the Gammon Ranges, there are painted shelters and engraved surfaces that have been documented in regional surveys but are not part of any public trail. The Adnia Mathanha people, whose country this is, have maintained custodianship of these sites across a history of pastoral industry, mining exploration, and more recently, scientific tourism. Some of the painted shelters contain imagery that researchers have linked to astronomical observation, specifically to the marking of seasonal cycles in the night sky as visible from the southern hemisphere. The connection between the imagery and the stars above the Flinders Ranges at particular times of year has been explored in published research, but the sites themselves are not visitable without direct arrangement through the relevant community organisations. The Pilbara, again, because its sheer scale demands more than one entry on any honest list of this kind. At a site that researchers refer to in published literature only by a general geographic designation rather than a specific name, there is a ground feature that was identified in aerial survey photography in the 1990s and has been the subject of periodic fieldwork since then. It consists of stones arranged in a pattern that extends over an area of several hectares. The pattern is not random. It incorporates lines, arcs, and what appear to be concentric arrangements that align with solar and lunar positions at specific times of year. Similar arrangements have been documented elsewhere in Australia, including in Victoria and in the Pilbara itself, and they have been cautiously interpreted as evidence of systematic astronomical observation practiced across multiple regions over a very long time span. The Pilbara example is among the largest and least disturbed. It is also on pastoral leasehold land with no formal protective status, which makes its continued existence in undisturbed condition a matter of ongoing concern rather than guaranteed fact. The Kimberley region of Western Australia contains what many researchers consider the most extraordinary rock art tradition in Australia and possibly on Earth. The Gwion figures, also known by the name Bradshaw figures, after the pastoralist who reported them to the outside world in 1891, appear on rock surfaces across an enormous area of the Kimberley and are notable for their elegance and detail. The figures are depicted with elaborate headdresses, tasselled garments, and ornaments. They predate the present dominant Kimberley art style by a period that has been estimated at somewhere between 17,000 and 50,000 years. The dating remains contested. What is not contested is that they represent a tradition distinct from what came immediately before and after them in the same locations. The Ngarinin, Wunambol, and Wurrora peoples, among others, are the custodians of this country and of the knowledge connected to these figures. Access to the Kimberley interior is genuinely difficult, even for well-resourced expeditions. The wet season makes most tracks impassable for months at a time. The dry season compresses access into a window that fills with pastoralists, researchers, and limited tourist operations competing for permits and tracks. The deep Kimberley, the country beyond the known tourist circuits of El Questro and the Gib River Road, is a different landscape entirely. The Laura Sandstone country of Queensland, which encompasses the Quinkan sites already mentioned, but extends well beyond them, contains painted galleries that have been documented in survey but not individually publicised. The number of individual sites recorded in the Cape York Rock Art Survey runs into the hundreds. The number open to the general public runs to a handful. The reasons are partly logistical, partly protective, and partly a matter of traditional owner determination. During the wet season, the rivers and creek systems of Cape York become impassable even to experienced travellers. During the dry season, the access tracks are rough, long, and require a degree of vehicle and navigation preparation that eliminates casual visitors. The galleries themselves, when reached, sit in silence of a quality that is genuinely difficult to describe. The sound of wind through spinifex, the sound of the rock contracting in the early morning cold, the images on the walls. There is a site in the Northern Territory, in the country south of the Arnhem Land escarpment, where a section of sandstone cliff contains a frieze of painted images that extends for more than a kilometre of continuous surface. It was recorded in an expedition report in the mid-20th century and has been visited by only a small number of researchers since. The region sits within the boundaries of the Arnhem Land Aboriginal Land Trust, and entry requires a permit that is not automatically granted to anyone who applies. The permit system exists because the communities whose country this is have the legal right to control who enters, a right that was formally recognised under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976 and has been maintained since. The frieze itself depicts figures, animals, and patterns across multiple stylistic periods. The researchers who have seen it describe it as one of the most significant concentrations of prehistoric imagery in Australia. It is not on any tourist itinerary. The last site on this list is not a single location, but a corridor, in the country between the Simpson Desert and the Strzelecki Track, following the line of ancient watercourses that once connected the interior lake systems when they held water. There are scattered archaeological deposits that have been identified through survey work, but not comprehensively studied. The deposits include stone tool scatters, hearth remnants with charcoal that has been dated to periods between 20,000 and 40,000 years before the present, and ground markings of the kind that appear across much of inland Australia without clear function in the academic literature. The corridor runs through pastoral leasehold and conservation reserve land. Parts of it are accessible by four-wheel drive in dry conditions. Parts of it are not accessible at all without helicopter support. There is no tourist infrastructure because there has never been funding or political will to create any, and the communities with ancestral connections to this country have not advocated for public access because they are occupied with the rather more pressing matter of maintaining their own relationships with it on their own terms. What connects all 12 of these places is not age alone, though the age is extraordinary. It is not remoteness alone, though the remoteness is real and in some cases absolute. What connects them is the gap between what they contain and what the rest of the country knows about them. Australia has invested heavily in a small number of ancient sites. Uluru draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Kakadu is a World Heritage Area with an international profile. But for every place that has been brought into public visibility, there are dozens that remain outside it, some by choice, some by circumstance, and some by the simple fact that nobody with a budget has ever decided they were worth an access road. The question of whether greater visibility would help or harm these sites is not straightforward. Rock art deteriorates under visitor pressure. Ochre surfaces are damaged by oils from human hands. Ground features are disturbed by foot traffic. The Dampier Archipelago shows what happens when a site of global significance becomes convenient to reach. Industrial development around Murujuga has exposed the petroglyphs to acid aerosols from the processing plants, and researchers have documented measurable degradation in images that survived 65,000 years before the gas industry arrived. The people whose knowledge systems are encoded in these landscapes are still here. That is the other thing the brochures tend to understate. These are not relics of a vanished culture. They are living components of ongoing relationships between communities and country. When an elder from the Matu people explains the significance of a particular rock formation in the Gibson Desert, they are not performing archaeology. They are maintaining knowledge that was entrusted to them by people who received it from people before them across a chain of transmission that extends back beyond the range of any instrument currently used to measure time in years. That continuity is the most remarkable thing about Australia's ancient sites. Not the images, not the engineering, not the astronomical alignments. The fact that the living inheritors of the tradition are present, that they survived colonization, dispossession, removal, and attempted erasure, and that they are still here, still maintaining the knowledge, still negotiating on their own terms over who gets access and on what conditions. The isolated ancient sites of Australia are isolated in part because their custodians want them that way, and that is not a tragedy. It is a decision made by people who have watched what visibility does to places that are not prepared for it. The sites that are not on any map are intact. The stories attached to them are intact. The relationships between the people and the place are intact. Those things have survived precisely because the country has not been opened up to everyone who is curious enough to go looking. There is still that canyon in the far northwest. The walls covered in figures no researcher has classified. 400 kilometers from the nearest sealed road. The walls are still watching. The questions still unanswered. And the knowledge required to ask the right ones belongs to people who have carried it across more generations than any written archive can measure. For now, that is exactly where the custodians want things to remain.